The Overton window represents the range of acceptable discourse within any given society. Ideas within the Overton window are given the privilege of being seen as reasonable and sane, while ideas outside the Overton window are shunned as unreasonable or unfeasible. People apply the Overton window to both individual issues and sets of beliefs. For example, when applied to tax, you can say that slightly more tax and slightly less tax are both within the Overton window. Saying that there should be no change to tax would be in the dead center of that Overton window, while having much more tax or much less tax would both be outside the Overton window on this issue. Most people don't use the Overton window when talking about individual ideas. They instead choose to use the Overton window to refer to whole sets of ideas. Now, the easiest way to categorize sets of ideas is through political frameworks, like ideologies. To illustrate this, here's a political line. The best and only way to illustrate political ideologies on a spectrum. The Overton window normally rests here in the center of that political line. Every ideology within the political line is a part of the privileged centrist class. If you're in the West, everything in this box is going to be some form of liberalism, whether that's social democracy on the moderate left or neoconservatism on the moderate right. One of the most important questions we can ask about the Overton window is how it's shifted over the years. What ideas were taboo 50 years ago but are now openly being discussed, and vice versa, what ideas are taboo now that weren't 50 years ago? How have the last 5 years, for example, shifted the Overton window? The last 5 years were pretty interesting. How have the last 5 months shifted the Overton window? The answer to that question is, it kind of depends on who you ask. If you ask a leftist how the Overton window is shifted, most of them will probably say that the Overton window has shifted to the right. They'll cite a rise in right-wing populism in Europe and across the West as an example of this. They would point to right-wing ousting of center-right ideals to more of a paleo-conservative, more nationalistic sort of ideology that's more mainstream now. Some leftists argue that this rise of right-wing populism leads to ideas like fascism now being circulated seriously. However, at the same time, many right-wingers argue that the Overton window has shifted to the left in recent times, but has also been shifting to the left over the last 50 years or so. A right-winger might observe that progressivism is the child of liberalism, and so if it's not the status quo now, it's at least its heir. They point to conservative ideas being pushed to the fringe of the Overton window, while ideas like cultural and economic Marxism proliferate in academia and media. After all, as Marx said, Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he always swims left. So what's going on here? The left says that the Overton window is shifting to the right, and the right says that the Overton window is shifting to the left. Could one of them be wrong? Impossible. Because there is literally no difference between the left and the right, in terms of how base they are, we must assume that both of these viewpoints are exactly correct. But how can the Overton window have shifted both to the left and to the right? Well, we're gonna have to do some science to explain that. Some political science. Hold on, I have a PhD. You have to have a very high IQ to understand drag. Now listen, I know a lot of you simpletons can't possibly understand this, but what you have to keep in mind is that the Overton window has a constant surface area that can never be broken. According to my exact, precise scientific measurements, the Overton window has exactly a surface area of 3 centimeters squared. Now remember, the Overton window moving like this would be impossible, because then the surface area would be greater than 3 centimeters squared, because it's made of glass. You can't stretch glass. I have come to the conclusion that this is the only way the Overton window could have possibly shifted. That's right, you can't stretch glass, but you can break it. It all makes sense now, doesn't it? Being in the dead center of the political spectrum is no longer within the Overton window. As the Overton window has become more accommodating to leftist ideologies and right-wing ideologies, it has become less accommodating towards centrist ideologies. Right-wingers have grabbed overt nationalism and dragged it into the Overton window, just as socialists have grabbed socialism and dragged it into the Overton window. Together, they have truly owned the libs. My theory is thus. Liberalism is failing. Extremist ideologies proliferate in online space. Narratives and counter-narratives that before have never had the chance to see the light of day now have the opportunity to jump from brain meat to brain meat. Even liberals are sort of gathering that they can no longer take for granted the fact that they have a liberal society anymore. Now, if people value liberalism, like actual liberalism, they now have to represent their ideals and fight for it and justify why they should have a liberal society. Now, some of you are already saying, "Oh, what's your source for any of this? It sounds like you're just making shit up." Okay, first of all, fuck you. Read a book. And by that, I mean watch a YouTube video. And by that, I mean watch this YouTube video. That's right, I'm my own source. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Leave a comment? Boost my algorithm rating? Rest in piss, truth, fellas. As much as I would like to take credit for this, it was all of us working together that threw the brick through the Overton window, shattering it into two halves that will never be bridged. I dream of a glorious future in which the Overton window cracks entirely. There is no range of acceptable discourse. Nothing is acceptable discourse. And yet, at the same time, everything is acceptable discourse. Everything will be permitted as different political ideologies try to replicate themselves. People think they have ideologies. The ideologies have people, and they will use these people to proliferate themselves. A great war of ideas loom. A battle royale of every feasible framework on the planet vying for domination. And whichever one wins, the status quo will lose.
To be fair, you have to have a very high IQ to understand dreg. The humor is extremely subtle, and without a solid grasp of political science, sociology, and psychology, most of the jokes will go right over a typical viewer's head. There's also Greg's accelerationist outlook, which is deftly woven into his characterization. His personal philosophy draws heavily from Nick Land's literature, for instance. The fans understand this stuff. They have the intellectual capacity to truly appreciate the depths of these jokes, to realize that they're not just funny. They see something deep about life. As a consequence, the people who dislike drag truly are idiots. Of course they wouldn't appreciate, for instance, the humor in Greg's existential catchphrase, "I want to fucking die," which itself is a cryptic reference to Jean-Paul Sartre's work. I'm smirking right now just imagining one of those addle-pated simpletons scratching their heads in confusion as Greg Guevara's genius wit unfolds on their computer screens. What fools! How I pity them. And yes, by the way, I do have a political compass tattoo. And no, you cannot see it. It's for the ladies' eyes only. And even then they have to demonstrate that they're within 5 IQ points of my own. Preferably lower beforehand. Nothing personnel, kid.